begin this way. I was going to bring in a piece of history, like from Wikipedia or some other source, but maybe some of you are from memory, you've heard the story, and or you've learned it in school. But the story of the Bismarck battleship. Does anyone know that story? Anyone that's sitting here today, does anyone remember? Maybe you've heard the name?
I've heard the name.
Or what's that?
I've heard the name.
You've heard the name? The Bismarck? And what war was that from, Landon? You remember? It was World War II. And if you ever have a chance to see a documentary on National Geographic or whatever the source is, I would strongly encourage you. It's fascinating to watch. It is another attempt of the Germans, and they had entered into, of course, out into the Navy and was warring against, of course, they had U-boats, and they came out with this battleship. This battleship proved to be lethal quickly. It had been engineered and powerful, and they felt like there was not anything in American or British fleets that could threaten. And if they could control the waterways, they realized that this would give them a victory in war, perhaps. So they rolled out the Bismarck, and immediately it fought ships like the Hood and other things that were very popular in that day, the British battleships. And it immediately sunk these ships in battle. And the world was in fear. What was going to happen? Because the Germans had demonstrated this technology, this machine, this battleship that they had launched. They realized it quickly was defeating ships, and it seemed like the Allies didn't have an answer. But from World War I, these old pilots, these planes, and right now I forget their names, and I don't want to throw a name out there and be wrong, but it doesn't matter. These planes, as the ship was progressing back towards Germany, these planes torpedoed the Bismarck. Now, one would say, well, these planes had no way of defeating the Bismarck. But what happened was, before the ship could get back to Germany, these torpedoes struck something on the Bismarck that the Germans never thought about. And that was the rudder. The rudder was struck by these old torpedoes, and the explosions disabled the rudder. So you have a battleship that is equipped with all the technologies of cannons and all the things, modern warfare for that day and era in the 1940s. They were equipped to defeat any other battleship in the oceans. Think of that. The Germans were equipped to defeat any other battleship. But now, this mighty battleship was, at best, going in circles because they couldn't guide the ship anymore. The rudder had been destroyed. And now they were encircled, and now the Allies could defeat because they had many ships and ways to attack because the Bismarck could not escape, and they sank this mighty ship. But it all happened because of a rudder. Think of that. This mighty ship was useless because of the rudder. What in life, in our life, sometimes is the rudder? Today we're going to talk about the title, Sticks and Stones and Words. They all hurt.
Pride.
They all hurt. Let me say, you know the saying, right? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me, harm me. Well, the title of today's lesson is Sticks and Stones and Words. They all hurt. And so we're going to talk about the power of words. The power of what we say, or sometimes what we don't say. Proverbs has a lot to teach us about words, and we're going to begin reading in Proverbs, the 12th chapter, verse 14. A man will be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth, and the recompense of a man's hands will be rendered to him. And then, if you look at chapter 13, verse 3, he who guards his mouth preserves his life, but he who opens wide his lips shall have destruction. And then the 18th chapter of Proverbs, verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. So progressively, we see the severity of the claims made about our speech, our tongue. Here it says, power of death and hell are in our tongues. And here it says, in going back to the 12th chapter, look at verse 14, which we read, a man will be satisfied with good by the fruit of his mouth. My mouth, the things that I say to people about situations, how I, as a father, speak to my children, or I speak to my spouse, or I speak to those at work, how I handle my vocabulary. There's power in what I say. It is as though a farmer throws seed out on the ground. That seed, if it's good seed, will bring a good crop, a good fruit. When I, by my mouth, sow seed, that is good seed. What is good seed? I like these words, like edify. You ever hear the word edify? What does the word edify mean? As a verb, an edifice is a large building or some type of building. So to edify means to build up. If I use my mouth to build up, what am I using my tongue to do? Encourage. Yes? Encourage. I find out that something in your life has happened. Maybe, let's just say, I hate to throw out anything because I know how it is. We all start thinking, well, I wonder who he's talking to. I'm not thinking of anybody. I'm not, I promise. I promise. But let's just say, because I come from a family, just like you have a family, and I have seen, I think many of us share common problems in one way or another. Let's say someone's struggling with an addiction. Let's say it's alcohol. You ever seen alcohol destroy someone's life? I have. It has. Some people, no. Have you ever seen gambling destroy a person's life? Yeah. Right? There's many ways to destroy a person's life. And I, according to God's Word, I would say this. I have the power to destroy anyone. You say, oh, with a gun? No. Guns can only do so much. The most deadly weapon a person has been born with is their tongue. Many a church has divided and broken apart. Many a family, many a marriage, many a whatever, a company, even a nation. You have a president who can't control his or her tongue, and they'll destroy a nation. They'll divide a nation. You have a leader in a church, and they will not use their tongue wisely, their words. They will harm, hurt others. Maybe you find out someone's having an issue. Maybe it's alcohol. Maybe whatever it is. Let's just don't name anything, because there's 1,000 upon 1,000 things that can trap people and hurt people. But you know, I could use my tongue to build you up. Let's just say Ed's having an issue today with something. I could go and criticize him and say, Ed, get your act together. Or maybe what he really needs to hear is, Ed, man, I'm sorry you're going through that. I'm praying for you. And I know it's got to be tough. But I and this church, we're here for you. You need us, you call on us. You need to pray, we'll pray with you. And we are going to work with you, and you're going to get through it, and it's all going to be okay. You see, I could use my mouth to encourage and build others up, or I could use my tongue to destroy someone. I remember one preacher, Jack Tishner, I often reference him. He was so good. This elderly, I knew him as elderly type evangelist preacher, and he visited here before. He visited almost all these area churches in Hamilton and Butler County. But he had such a powerful way. When he'd meet you, he'd shake your hand, a young man like Landon. I remember one time he shook my hand. When I was a little older than Landon the first time I met Jack. And Jack Tishner said, I'm Jack Tishner. And he was a little guy, stature-wise, but in God's sight, he was a giant. And he shook my hand, and he said, son, you know what you look like to me? And you say, well, I don't even know what that means. But here's what he said. He said, you look like an eagle. good about myself. But he said that to me, and I tell you, my feet wasn't touching the ground. I was about to take off flying. Well, you know what I mean. I think the message is clear. When we take our speech, our vocabulary, the things that we say, or sometimes we don't say, when we use our mouths to build one another up, what we will do is we are investing a fruit of life, right? That's what we need to be as Christians. And the most powerful way we do that is not necessarily with our hands, but with our mouth. Yeah? How else can I invest in people's lives? How else? Sharing Jesus, right? We invest in people's lives when we are bold and we take the opportunity to share Jesus with somebody. I knew a man, his last name was Bowman. I went to church with him. He was one of those people you follow, just like Hobart. You met him, and I tell you, the first day I met Mr. Bowman was at a church in Cincinnati, and I spent years working with him in the church. And the first time I met him, he was a guy, he criticized me, but he was so funny. And he made fun of something I did, and it was funny. I leave myself open to a lot of opportunities to be made fun of. But anyway, he made fun of me, but he was one of those guys who just loved from the start. But he told me how he came to know the Lord, and I share that with you. He said, I was at work, and he said, this guy come up, and this guy loved to repair old cars, Mr. Bowman. And he would take cars, and fix up these old 57 Chevys and things like that. And so this man walked in to work one day, and he said, hey, what'd you do this weekend? He said, I cleaned up my car. And he said, this man replied to me, he said, did you do anything to clean up your soul? And he said, I turned around to let him have it because I hated hearing Christians talk, at least at that point in his life. And he said, you know what, though God had just brought that man into my life to say those words to me at the right time, he said it was like a dagger. And here he is telling me this on the front pew of a church. He said, that was step number one. He said, I had no reply to him. He said, but a great burden in my heart began to swell. He said, no, I realized I didn't have my life at peace with God. And he said, then the second thing happened. My mother, who had preached to me about Jesus, she lived Jesus, preached Jesus. You got to have them hand in hand, right? You can't say one thing and do something else. He said she had passed away. And he said, I went to the funeral service, and there was my mom in a casket. And he said, all I could hear was her words to me as a boy about Jesus. He said, I seen her live the story she told, but he said, all I could hear in my mind was the words of my mother about how I needed Jesus. And I didn't want anything to do with God, but all I could think of at that casket was the words of my mother. And then he said, I was out on my apple orchard, and I've told this story before, and he said I was trimming my apple trees, and he said out there in Kentucky, he said I heard somebody, as though it was a man, right next to me, scream out, Joe, you're lost. And he said, I turned off my chainsaw, and I said, who is here? He said, I thought for sure a man was here. And he said, I heard somebody say something about being lost. And he said, I started up my chainsaw again. He said, Paul, as clear as day, I heard someone say, Joe, you're lost. And it echoed throughout all those woods. He said, I turned off the chainsaw, and the words that I heard penetrated my heart. I was lost. And he said, I know that Jesus was looking for me in the apple orchard. Isn't that something? And he said, I went to church that day. He said, I just picked a church. And he said, I went there, and that preacher preached about how Jesus came. He preached the gospel to die for our sins. And he said, I knew that was the message I needed to hear. And he said, before that preacher could get done, I ran to the altar, and I gave my life to Christ. He said, that's why I'm here today. He was there because people invested words. Words, truthful words, words of love, words of wisdom. We invest our mouths, and we invest, and it comes back to us. Right? Yes?
I've heard it for the last 10 minutes until you said apple orchard. I was going to keep my mouth shut. But Proverbs 25:11 says, a word that fitly spoken is like apples, gold, and pictures of silver. So if we don't adhere to telling somebody, hey, I've been praying for you, it could be at the exact right time. And when you said apple orchard, I said, man, Ed say it.
Yeah, thank you.
25:11.
25:11, Proverbs 25:11. I looked that over and saw it. How appropriate. Proverbs is filled. And I think it's filled with so much instruction about the tongue. There's a reason for it. Because number one, we got a problem with our tongues. And two, it's so important to learn to use our tongues wisely. Yes? Jesus was so very good at it. Yes? Jesus, when he was on earth, he would speak to people. And he knew what to say, and he knew when to say it. And he would always share the truth without compromise, without apologizing. But he always did it in the spirit of God's love. And he always did it to build others up. Right? Anybody who saw him meet, the woman at the well, so many different stories, the thief on the cross next to Jesus that he spoke to, and all the people that he would encounter, those that society had pretty much given up and spoke harshly about. They called them sinners, and Jesus would go to them and speak words of kindness, words of instruction and love, forgiveness. How powerful it is to tell somebody, I forgive you, or I'm sorry. Those are powerful words. When you say it out of love and conviction. Yeah. Someone comes to you and say, will you forgive me? And you say, I love you, I forgive you. And don't say, well, how could you? We're good at that, right? I know a kid comes to right of our sons and daughters said, Dad, you forgive me? And you say, all right, but I never want it. No buts about it. God's love stops there, right? And somebody comes to say, hey, I'm sorry. I say, I love you, I forgive you. And stop. Man, that's powerful. It's not about conditions after that. Say, well, I forgive you, but next time I'm going to wrap you on the head. That's love, and we need to use our mouths wisely. Let's go on. In chapter 18 and verse 2. Let's look at chapter 18 and verse 2. A fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart. And look at verse 13. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. Here, what is it saying? Sometimes, as I said before, the mouth is powerful, what we say, but sometimes it's being quiet, a good listener. Here's what it is saying, right? Be careful how quickly you respond and speak. For example, if you start speaking out of a heart filled with anger and vengeance, you're going to say the wrong thing, guaranteed. God, does he ever get angry? Yes. But it's always in the control of God's love and holiness. Always. These are the things that describe God. God can be love, but also God is sometimes angry. But all things that God does, he's always right because he's always in control. Now, I don't understand all about God, but what he tells me is I, too, the fruit of the Spirit, is that I'm to be self-controlled, so that sometimes I need to hear the matter before I speak. I need to hear everything. That person that's talking to me, I need to hear all that they have to say, because what I might say or cut them off, I may give them the wrong response. A fool, the Bible says here, it teaches, a foolish person is always quick to answer because they're full of pride. They always know it, right? They always know the answer. You ever met somebody like that? They always want to do the talking. They always want to share before they even hear the matter. They're already giving instruction. They're already criticizing somebody. But a wise person will always be willing to listen. Jesus, he knew the answers, but he was always willing to listen to people, share their problems, share their concerns. And Jesus was a good listener. Before he would speak, he would let them share. You and I, we need to take a wise lesson from Proverbs. We need to be good listeners. Before I attack you or criticize or even give you what I think is going to be a good idea or good instruction, the first thing I need to do is to listen. Because otherwise, if I'm always talking and I'm always sharing my right way, right? If it's God's way, it's always the right way, but sometimes we feel like we're always right. Anybody meet somebody like that? A lot of you might say, Paul, I'm looking at somebody like that. You're looking at me. I hope not, but sometimes I'm sure I feel that way. Landon's shaking his head. Yes, that's Dad. But sometimes we need to be careful, right? we as parents, or whoever we might be, or even young people, yeah, I know I sat in that chair where Brian and some of these young, Landon and others, I felt like a lot of times my dad was out of touch. I got older, and Dad knew a lot of what he's talking about. Mom knew a lot about what she's talking about, but I didn't want to hear it in my time because I felt like they're in another generation. They hadn't gone through what I did. Foolish thing, right? I learned this past experience this week at the funeral service. It's not here. We're here to brag about Jesus, but nevertheless, I learned about our good friend Hobart and our learning. He had jumped out of an airplane and broke his leg on 2 different occasions. He had been in battle. He had suffered many times where he could have lost his life. And I just want to ask a question. Don't you think somebody like that, probably from experience, they probably got a lot of good things to tell you about living, no matter what your age is. They can relate. You say, I'm afraid of something. I bet Hobart can tell you a lot about what it means to be afraid. Yeah? You see, the point is that every person here, no matter what your age, we all should be good listeners to one another. Because just because someone's, say, 80 or 90 years of age, that person might have lived through the Great Depression, a World War, Vietnam War. They've been through things. They've seen illnesses. They've lost children. They've been through troubles and trials. And they've probably got some pretty good sound advice to give to somebody. So we need to be quiet and just listen. Yeah. Good listeners. A wise person is a good listener. And you weigh the facts. If they're looking for advice, just listen for a while. Let them share the story. Let them share their thoughts. Chapter 18, verse 8. Another subject. The words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles, and they go down into the inmost being. Now, your translation will probably read a little bit different, but it's talking about gossip. And it's saying, it's comparing, it says it's like a sweet-tasting dessert that goes down into the belly. So what is that saying? Well, it's telling us that people love to gossip, and it tastes pretty good at the time. People love to gossip. Is that true or not? That is true, isn't it? What is gossip? What is gossip to you? Anyone? What does it mean? You hear the word gossip or a talebearer. What does that mean? Someone?
It's usually spreading something mean about somebody.
Yeah.
That's
Spreading something mean.
Yeah.
Harmful. Tearing down somebody's character. And we enjoy doing it. Is that true? The news feeds on it. Yeah. A president or whoever it is, a preacher or anybody who has some type of role in leadership, the news feeds on it. It makes good stories. And you hear about it until finally some other story develops. And then we feed on the other gossip. But it is. It's sad to say, but that's true. We need to be truthful in our studies with God and here in this church. We need to be truthful. We need to be very cautious when we hear stories and tales about others. You say, well, maybe it's true. Well, sometimes we don't need to be sharing everything we know about people. It ought to stop. You can tear apart a person's life. Even, can you think of somebody, you hear stories about people that's been brought up, and maybe it's true, sometimes it's not. Someone has, a woman, let's just say, a woman, it could be a man. I'm not at all trying to, please don't twist this, but let's say a woman says that man over there, he offended me by something he did at work or said. Now, a year later, after it goes through maybe testimony and witness, maybe it's proven that never happened. But you know what? Something did happen. Their character was destroyed, and the respect people had for them, maybe at home, their children, their wife, or husband, whatever it is, however the story is. You see, whenever you start sharing gossip, it may not even be true, but what you've done is you're tearing apart someone's life. And we need to be careful because our words can be very powerful. Powerful to help others, or very powerful to hurt others. Maybe you know some hidden secret about somebody. Maybe somebody, they come before God and say, please forgive me. And God forgives them, and their heart was sincere. And if God's willing to forgive them, then we ought to be willing to forgive them. Otherwise, that means we're bigger than God. True. So if God forgives them, but you find out, but did you know what they did in 1983? It's true. And it could be true. It might be a truthful fact. Something they did or said. And you know what happens? Soon everybody knows about it. They come walking into church, and there's 50 people staring at them. They're like, why is everybody looking at me? Right? Because someone, a talebearer, a gossiper, they destroyed them. That's why Proverbs teaches we need to be cautious what we're doing with our mouths. When we're talking with our mouths, we need to be mindful. I can either use these words to build up others and to glorify God, or I will tear about others' lives and I can hurt them forever. I've seen people's lives just wrecked. I've seen people in my family. I know because their dad especially sometimes was so always critical and harmful with his words. And his words, he could have taken his hand and backslapped his son or daughter or whatever, and that would have caused less damage than always cussing at them and telling them how stupid they were and always comparing them to some stupid animal or object. That sometimes, that really hurts a child. And they never recover because they always think, well, I couldn't please my father. I had never measured up to my mom and dad. And it makes them always, their effort in life is to prove themselves to others because they never heard these words from mom and dad. I love you and I'm proud of you. I like to tell my kids I'm proud of them. You say, what are you proud of? I'm just proud of my kids. I saw it on Andy Griffith one time. You ever see that episode? I watch a lot of Andy Griffith. Said, Paul, I haven't on TV since 1960. Well, it's on my house almost every day. But anyway, Andy Griffith, of course, his son is who? Opie, right? And accidentally, Andy gets the wrong card from school, that his report card that shows his son Opie had gotten an A in math, something like that. And he goes around gossiping, Andy does, to the town, telling everybody how smart his son is. The truth is, Opie is almost failing math, but the teacher accidentally got the grades mixed up, and she put someone else's A, and he should have got a D, or something like that. And he gets his son Opie a brand new bicycle and says, here, go ride this bicycle. I'm so proud of you because of getting an A. And he tells all the people in the town, the barber, and everybody hears the story how smart Opie is, and they make a big deal out of it. Well, then Opie can't live with the guilt because he knows that he's failing, and he knows he's not very good at math, and he knows that his dad is going to be so disappointed. So what happens? Does anybody know the story here? You get a donut. You already got a donut. But anybody knows what happens? What does Opie do? Everybody see the episode? I'm feeling really old here. He leaves. He runs away. Little tiny Opie runs away from home. And Andy finds out from the teacher that there's been a flip on the grades, and actually Opie's getting a D. And at first, Andy's mad, but he realizes his son's been living with his guilt. He drives out to the outside of Mayberry, and there's little Opie walking down the street. And he gets out of the car, and he says, where are you going? He said, I thought I'd go join the Marines. And maybe if I'm in the Marines, I can do something to make you proud of me again, and then I'll come back home. And Andy puts his head down. There's always a pretty good lesson in those shows. And he says, son, he apologizes for what he had done because Andy had made the mistake. He said, I'm proud of you no matter what you're doing, man. I'm just proud of you because you're my son. And we ought to live life like that. That doesn't mean we have to approve of bad habits. I'm not saying that. But sometimes we need to be careful as parents or even at church what you say to people. And, sometimes we just need to tell somebody I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you. And I always think back on life, I always wonder, not that my dad should ever have to tell me that. But my dad never did say that to me. And I wish he had. It would have been nice to hear. And maybe he just wasn't proud of me. Maybe he wasn't. But I hope he would have been in one way or another. But that means a lot to a kid to hear these words. I love you, and I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry. Sometimes we need to tell our kids I'm sorry. I say a lot of these things because Proverbs teaches us a lot about how we handle our mouths, because we hurt and injure one another, just not our kids, we injure one another. How many times I've seen a church split apart because of what one woman or what one man said about another, and all of a sudden it gets told and it gets bigger. Now it gets exaggerated, and some things are really not even true, and no one even knows, and people take sides, and suddenly you know what happens to that church that was growing and people were being saved and the gospel of Jesus was being proclaimed. It's no longer about that. Everybody's talking behind the scenes about that gossip, about that story, and God's not happy with it. And you know what happens? The church splits apart, and it's never ever the same again. That's sad. And it happens. Let me see what time it is. We're going to have to close, and I didn't get to everything. So many things we could talk about, isn't it? But I want to close though the book of James. Here's the final scripture I'd like to read. So let's go to the New Testament. James, the 3rd chapter, and verse 3. So if you find Hebrews, you're almost there. Turn over in between James, Hebrews and 1 Peter, you'll find James hiding there. The 3rd chapter, and I want us to look and close with verses 3 to 8. Are you there? James chapter 3, verse 3. Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. Now look at verse 5 and notice, underline how it ends. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. Well said, isn't it? Verse 6, the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell. Those are powerful words. Verse 7, for every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But notice verse 8. Everyone listen. Listen carefully, verse 8. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Wow. And let us close with those words. Those are great words of advice and instruction. Yeah. God's Word tells us the tongue is very, very serious. How we use it, how we control it. There's a time to speak. There's a time to be silent. But when we do speak, let us use it to glorify God by building others up. Words of kindness, words of truth, but always coming from a heart of love. All right, thank you so much.